Good day. Today is Wednesday, 23rd July 2025, and over the last 24 hours we've seen protests in Ukraine, in 4 Ukrainian cities, more commentaries in Western media criticizing President Zelensky, more talk from some people that another Maidan event, in other words, another protest movement leading to the overthrow of the government in Ukraine is round the corner, and there have been admissions from General Syrsky of a deteriorating situation logistically with the Ukrainian armed forces, and the Ukrainians are now sitting down, or will be, probably by the time this video appears, will be sitting down meeting with the Russians in Istanbul. So what does all of this mean? Well, let me turn first of all to the protests, and let me say that in my opinion they mean much less than some people imagine. I don't think there's going to be a second Maidan or anything like that, and I think that the events of the last couple of days, the attack by the Ukrainian authorities on the 2 anti-corruption organizations, NABU in particular, that are based in Ukraine, they've been widely misunderstood, and this event is not being reported properly. Briefly, let's talk first of all about the protests. Reports that I've seen make it quite clear that the protests are small and relatively few in number, and that the people who make up the protests are very young people, mostly students, the sort of people who turn out to these protests and who are particularly susceptible to calls to protest from the various NGOs and other organizations, Western financed organizations, that particularly target and seek to influence them. These are not the sort of people whose protests overthrow governments, and there aren't enough of them out there to threaten a government like Zelensky's. Notably, there is no sign of support for these protests from anyone within the military. The nationalist brigades remain clearly loyal, at least at the moment. They may not think very much of Zelensky personally, but they're certainly not going to overthrow his government at the bidding of the sort of people who are protesting in Ukraine now. And, well, the larger, bigger sections of Ukrainian society that one might expect to come out in serious protests in order to bring down the government, working class people and people from the rural localities, especially in the west of Ukraine, who I remember coming to Kiev in large numbers in 2013 and who played a big role in making possible the Maidan protests. Well, they're not coming, and they're not joining these protests either, including the one that took place in West Ukraine's capital, the city of Lvov. So these protests in and of themselves don't threaten Zelensky. Moreover, there is no sign that any of the big oligarchs who have dominated Ukrainian politics since Ukrainian independence are backing these protests to any degree. As has been claimed by some people, over the course of the war, the oligarchs anyway, some of them at least, have lost a measure of influence, though I think this is something that is perhaps misunderstood. And my own sense is that Zelensky, at least, is now closely allied with one particular oligarch, who is Rinat Akhmetov, the former boss of the Donbass, widely believed to be Ukraine's richest man, the person who some believe has bankrolled the Azov brigades, the various Azov brigades, and somebody who obviously wants the Donbass recovered to Ukraine, because that is where a lot of his investments are. I think it is fairly clear to people who follow Ukrainian politics closely that Zelensky and Akhmetov are working quite closely with each other. Zelensky's former patron, Igor Kolomoisky, based in Dnipro, seems to have fallen out of the picture. I get the sense that in terms of oligarch politics, a murky subject at the best of times, it is Akhmetov who is currently on top. Anyway, put that aside. The point is that in 2013, 2014, during the protests that took place then against President Yanukovych, and which brought his government down, the protesters had the backing of certain of the powerful oligarchs within Ukraine, including, by the way, the former President Petro Poroshenko, former president, because he became president after the Maidan events took place. Lastly, I see no evidence that Western governments are heavily backing these protests. Now, there's been a lot of comment recently about how supposedly the closing down of these two anti-corruption agencies might turn the West against Zelensky. There's certainly been some critical comments made by some Western officials. The former Prime Minister of Estonia has denounced them and that kind of thing. But overall, this has all been met with deafening silence from the West, and on the contrary, so far from the West stepping back from further support for Ukraine, which means ultimately at the present time support for Zelensky, I get the impression that the Europeans at least are still trying to step up their support instead of reducing it. There are reports in Newsweek today, for example, that the Dutch government is trying to find some means to provide Ukraine with air defense systems, Patriot missile systems. That the German government, Boris Pistorius, apparently he has come out and said that Germany is willing to supply Ukraine with up to 5 Patriot air defense missile systems. 5 out of the 12 that Germany has just a short time ago. Pistorius was saying that Germany was in no position to send any more Patriot missiles or Patriot missile interceptors because it had already depleted its stockpiles of systems and missiles so significantly that were it to part with even more, that would compromise Germany's security position. And apparently Friedrich Merz said the same to Donald Trump over the course of their telephone conversation on the 4th of July. And there's been other statements from Boris Pistorius subsequent to that conversation between Donald Trump and Merz on the 4th of July, also saying that Germany was no longer in a position to provide any more Patriot missile interceptors, let alone complete systems. But now we see Boris Pistorius coming forward, even as these two anti-corruption agencies are being closed down and people are protesting in Kiev, and even, by the way, as the Russians destroy Patriot missile systems in Ukraine, as they claimed to have done yesterday. I discussed this in yesterday's program. Anyway, here we have Boris Pistorius saying that Germany is prepared to part with 40% of its Patriot missile systems and stockpiles. Well, it's not yet happened, and there still remains some things that the Germans say they need to do. Apparently, there's been a lot of pressure put on Switzerland, which was first in the queue amongst European states to receive Patriot missiles and Patriot missile systems from the United States. Anyway, there's been a lot of pressure on the Swiss to step back, to agreed to take a later place in the queue so that the Americans can provide Germany with Patriot missile systems that had originally been intended for Switzerland. These apparently are not due to arrive in Switzerland since 2027 or 2028, and I'm not sure how many it is that will come. And of course, given America's own shortages of Patriot missile interceptors and systems, and given the very fragile situation in the Middle East, it may be that these Patriot missiles and Patriot missile systems, originally intended to be supplied to Switzerland, but now to be supplied to Germany, well, it may be that they won't arrive until after 2027 or 2028, perhaps long after 2027 or 2028, or perhaps never at all. Just saying. The Germans apparently haven't yet signed any documents. There's been no formal agreement to agree to any of this. They say they want the Americans to provide guarantees that these Patriot missile systems will come. They are asking, in other words, the Americans for some piece of paper. We've seen how the Americans treat pieces of paper like that. I can quite easily imagine the United States signing off on some kind of guarantee to Germany that the Patriot missile systems will indeed arrive in 2027 or 2028. But that, of course, doesn't mean that they will actually do so. But anyway, that is the plan at the moment. That's the discussion at the moment. And that's what the German media is talking about and what Boris Pistorius is talking about. And Friedrich Merz too, by the way. There is no hint here in any of this that the German government has been in the least put off by the fact that Zelensky has just, in effect, closed down, or to be more precise, brought under the control of Ukraine's Procurator General, its Attorney General equivalent, these two anti-corruption agencies. So let's now go back and ask why, in fact, did Zelensky close down these two anti-corruption agencies? Now, the first thing to say is that it is absolutely correct that these two agencies were actually set up at the insistence of the West after the Maidan coup, and that to all intents and purposes they have been controlled by the West. If we're talking about NABU, I understand that most of its board is made up of Europeans or European officials. There are Ukrainian officials, but they are carefully selected to ensure that they are the kind of people that the Europeans and the Americans trust. I also understand that the United States pays most of the bills and basically has been steering the anti-corruption policies of these two agencies. I remember seeing papers during an earlier period, during the time of Donald Trump's first impeachment, as a matter of fact, at a time when there were indeed investigations going on in Ukraine about various corrupt activities which had a bearing on American politics, and which did lead ultimately to Donald Trump's first impeachment. I remember reading various materials, documents and other things at that time, which made it absolutely clear in almost every way that NABU and this other agency were controlled by the West. They were not under Zelensky's control or the control of any Ukrainian government, and they were not controlled previous to Zelensky, by President Poroshenko's government. As it happens, I understand that Poroshenko himself is quite happy to see these two agencies essentially closed down. And Yulia Tymoshenko, fiery oppositionist that she has been, often great critic of Zelensky, she too is delighted to see these two agencies closed down, and she has made that point clear in the debate in the Ukrainian parliament. The Ukrainian parliament has voted overwhelmingly to close these two agencies down, or let me correct myself again, to bring these two agencies under the direct control of the Ukrainian Procurator General. In other words, ultimately under Zelensky's control. Now, when one expresses it in this way, I think one understands exactly what is going on. It's not that Zelensky currently is afraid that there is some kind of regime change plot against him in the United States or in Washington. There is no sign of that at all. I know that Seymour Hersh claimed as much in a recent article that he wrote on his blog, but to repeat again, I see no evidence of this at all. I see no sign that the administration is at all interested in Zelensky and is seeking to remove him. And for the record, I also believe that Donald Trump, for reasons which go back to that impeachment during his first term, the first impeachment, would be delighted to see these two agencies closed down. As far as he is concerned, they were never controlled by people who he thought were his friends. So what I think has happened is part of this tightening of control that Zelensky and his officials have been conducting in Kiev for many months now. In fact, arguably, ever since the dismissal of General Zaluzhny from his position as military chief in Ukraine last year. Ever since then, Zelensky has been tightening control of all of the various agencies of the Ukrainian government, centralizing control under himself and his chief of staff, Andrei Yermak. And the reason, I think, is very simple, and I've discussed it in programs on this channel and on the Duran. My colleague and friend Alex Christoforou and I have discussed this as well. Zelensky is perfectly well aware at some level of the gathering crisis that Ukraine is facing on the battlefronts. He knows fully well what the situation in Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka is. He knows the enormous imbalance in the war in the sky. He knows about the shortages of Patriot missile interceptors in the West. He knows that even if the Germans do eventually get round to supplying him with 5 Patriot missile systems, which, by the way, they will. There's never been a situation where Germany has said it would supply weapons and then failed to do so. So they will supply these Patriot missile interceptors. As I understand it, some of them use older versions of the Patriot missile, not the PAC-3 anti-ballistic missiles. There's been a spate of articles in the media in the West, in the Wall Street Journal and other places, that even the advanced PAC-3 Patriot missile can no longer successfully shoot down incoming advanced Russian Iskander-M and Kinzhal ballistic and hypersonic missiles. So Zelensky knows all about that. He knows that the situation is becoming increasingly critical, but his priority remains the same as it has been for a long time: to retain control of Ukraine, retain control of Ukraine until the absolute bitter end, until either the collapse happens or, if there can be some kind of negotiated peace, but only one on his terms, up to the moment when that peace arrives. He is not going to settle for less, and he is not going to surrender control. And if there is a collapse, he wants to be president still at the moment of that collapse, and he wants to continue to be president beyond that collapse. And if that means setting up a government somewhere in the west of Ukraine, in Lvov, for instance, or if that is no longer possible, setting up a government in Europe somewhere, well, he would settle for that too. It's not obviously his desired outcome. It's not optimally what he wants, not remotely. But if it is all he can get, it is what he will settle for, and it is what he is seeking to ensure. He wants to remain president of Ukraine, in effect, in perpetuity, either by continuing the war and then ending it on his terms, or if the war is lost, by remaining president of Ukraine, either in Western Ukraine or in exile. And of course, by definition, in order to do that, in order to achieve that, given that sentiment in Ukraine is indeed shifting against him, not just the people who are protesting now, but wider sentiment, the people who are too intimidated to go out and protest, and who don't really care about NABU and the other anti-corruption agency, because they know all about corruption in Ukraine, and they know how ineffectual and weaponized those two organizations have been, and how irrelevant their work has been to the lives of the people of Ukraine, whom I am talking about now. Anyway, Zelensky knows all about the shift in opinion in Ukraine, and if he is to retain control in the way that I have just described, he cannot allow, by definition, any institutions to continue to function in Ukraine which would be independent of himself. And that is the entire reason why this has happened. As it is, as I said, most of the Ukrainian political class has supported him because they are mistrustful of these agencies, which they see as having been used by the West to control Ukrainian politics. So they back Zelensky in this matter, but his own motives are not difficult to see. And of course, Zelensky knows perfectly well that at this point in time in the war, with his position anyway secure, and with the imperative in Europe on the part of the Europeans to keep the war going as long as possible, to hope for some miracle that Russia might lose after all. Well, given that that is so, Zelensky knows that he can close these two agencies down, which have been a thorn in his side and previously in President Poroshenko's side, and a thorn in the side of many other Ukrainian politicians, Yulia Tymoshenko, his current patron, Rinat Akhmetov. Any one of these people could be fingered and targeted by one of these organizations at any time. Anyway, he knows that they will back him, and he knows that the Europeans and the Americans won't object. Now, there might be a further twist to this, and here now I am moving from what I would call analysis. Everything that I have discussed up to now is analysis, or if you like, commentary, fact-based commentary, based on actual experience and knowledge of what I have of the situation in Ukraine. What I'm now going to say takes us entirely into speculation, and I'm going to say perhaps even somewhat wild speculation. There is, at the present time, a major eruption of scandal again in Washington. There is the unresolved questions about the financier who committed suicide, or so we're told, in somewhat strange circumstances, and whose case President Trump doesn't want to see investigated any further. He continues to make comments about this, extremely unwise comments, in my opinion. He's coming under considerable pressure to open up the books on this investigation, and he is resisting it. I am not going to waste time discussing this investigation further. I've made my own views perfectly clear. I think there's a mountain of unanswered questions which I would absolutely want to see answered. I'm not able to give answers to those questions myself. I too share the general dismay at the fact that that investigation is not being pursued to its conclusion. There is now another scandal brewing as well, and this is the scandal relating to the Russiagate allegations that beset Donald Trump during his first term. The Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, is now releasing more and more information about the genesis of Russiagate. Again, I'm not going to get into the details of this in this program, but suffice to say that all of the initial issues of Russiagate, which on the Duran we covered exhaustively back in 2016 and 2017 and all the way up to the eventual publication of Robert Mueller's report and beyond that. Anyway, all of that is there out in is now coming out into the open, and it is being re-litigated and rediscussed all over again. And in the midst of all of this, there is one individual who connects all of these events, and that is Donald Trump. Now, I'm not saying that the investigation relating to the financier and the Russiagate investigation are connected in any way to each other. They are not. They're completely different things. The motivation behind them is completely different. But one individual has a presence in both of them, and that person is Donald Trump. In completely, entirely different ways, I want to stress. And of course, this same individual, Donald Trump, was also the target of that first impeachment that I spoke about earlier in the program, which involved all kinds of allegations floating around in Ukraine about President Biden's son and his work in the gas industry in Ukraine and all sorts of other things as well. Anyway, the point is that NABU, all of these agencies, as I said earlier in the program, did play a role in the events leading up to that impeachment. Not, I would stress, a direct role. And I want to again make that absolutely clear. But given, as I said, this swirl of scandal that we're now starting to see develop in Washington, given Donald Trump's experience of the kind of way in which information comes out of Ukraine or came out of Ukraine during his first term, causing him enormous political problems, to put it mildly, including, incidentally, the discrediting and eventual prosecution and imprisonment of his first campaign manager, Paul Manafort. Just saying. Given that that all is so, I would not be surprised if at this particular point in time, Zelensky not only knew that Donald Trump would not be especially bothered if NABU and the other anti-corruption agency were closed down, but had been informed of that fact. Now, I want to make it absolutely clear again that this is speculation on my part. Nobody's told me this. I probably am completely wrong. But anyway, that's the fact. I don't think that anybody, apart from a few European officials, people in the European Commission, a number of people like that, I don't think anybody is going to be sorry, in truth, to see these two organisations closed down. Anybody important, that is. So anyway, I spent an awful lot of time on this, but let me repeat again. There's not going to be a Maidan. I don't believe it. And there's not going to be any major backlash against Zelensky from the West because he's closed these two organizations down, nor is his position currently under political threat. He, on the contrary, has taken advantage of a certain state of events to close these two organizations and to consolidate his control of Ukraine and of political life in Ukraine still further. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this. I don't expect to be returning to this topic, either of these protests or of these two organizations, in future programs, unless, of course, I turn out to be wrong and we do see these protests expand, which, however, I personally think is unlikely. Now, the other thing which is happening now, perhaps as you're watching this program, is this meeting in Istanbul between the Russian and Ukrainian delegations. And this is a somewhat mysterious affair. I've already said that it is my belief that it is the Americans, Donald Trump, who has pushed for them. I believe that Donald Trump does not want to impose the 100% tariffs on India and China in September that he has in effect committed himself to do if there is no ceasefire or freezing of the conflict or deal between Ukraine and Russia in that time. I think that for that reason, he has made it clear to Zelensky that he does not want to see Rustem Umerov, the chief negotiator, the Ukrainian chief negotiator, sacked or reassigned to Washington. He wants him back in Istanbul, where he apparently already is, leading the Ukrainian delegation. And he wants to see movement happen. He wants to see the negotiations take place to provide him with an exit ramp so he doesn't need to impose those massive tariffs that he's been threatening or that he has threatened in September. That is my view because it is the only way to explain Zelensky's complete reversal on this issue. As I said, just 2 weeks ago, Zelensky was making public comments about the fact that Istanbul had run its course, that it was not making any kind of progress, that the Russians weren't interested in talking about a freeze or a ceasefire or a summit meeting between Putin and himself. The Russians have, by the way, again reiterated that they are not interested at the present time in a summit meeting between Putin and Zelensky, and that one should not expect that to be the outcome of the current talks, the talks that are going to happen in Istanbul. So it remains inexplicable that after taking this very clear stance, Zelensky should have suddenly shifted his position as dramatically as he has. And of course, it may be that the military situation has played a role in influencing Zelensky to change his position, or it could be that he's been under some pressure to change his position from within Ukraine. But I've never seen any evidence of Zelensky do anything like that. And if he really did want to negotiate with the Russians seriously, then he would be making proposals that the Russians might be prepared to work with. And for the moment, he is not doing that. So I think he was forced to send the delegation to Istanbul because the Americans made it absolutely clear that that was what they wanted him to do. The negotiations in Istanbul will produce some results. There will probably be more humanitarian exchanges, more exchanges of prisoners, more exchanges of bodies of dead Ukrainian and Russian soldiers, many more Ukrainian than dead Russian soldiers. That's been the consistent pattern up to now. But it seems that on the underlying political issues, the gulf between Russia and Ukraine remains as great as always. Now, that brings me back to what I think were Trump's motivations in insisting on this meeting, which is that he wants some sort of progress to happen in the diplomacy between Russia and Ukraine, so that when his 50-day time limit expires, he's got an opt-out so that he doesn't have to impose the tariffs that he's threatening. Now, the trouble with this is that the Chinese are in an implacable mood and the Russians are not making any concessions. There's been a further comment from the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman on this topic, and I'm just going to discuss it. It was made earlier today, by the way. Now, briefly, the Chinese finance and economics people are due to meet Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary, next week. The purpose of this meeting, the declared purpose of this meeting, is to put the recent agreements that were reached between China and the United States in talks in Geneva and London, talks which ended the economic war that raged between China and the United States in March and April. Anyway, the purpose of this meeting next week is supposedly to build on those agreements reached in Geneva and London, as I said, which ended the economic war, or briefly paused the economic war that was raging between China and the United States in March and April. Now, Bessent, inevitably, has been asked as to whether or not, in light of Trump's 50-day ultimatum to Russia, and by extension to China and India and all those countries as well, Bessent would bring up this ultimatum when he spoke with the Chinese over the course of next week. And Bessent said that he might do. So Bloomberg asked the Chinese foreign policy spokesman, Guo Xiaokun, how China would respond to this. And I'll set out the question and the answer. So the question from Bloomberg was, US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said he will meet his Chinese counterparts in Stockholm next week for their third round of trade talks aimed at extending a tariff truce and widening the discussions. He also said the negotiations may take on a broader array of topics, including Beijing's continued purchase of oil from Russia and Iran. I wonder if you could confirm the dates of the trade talks and comment on whether Beijing is willing to discuss oil purchases from Russia and Iran. And Guo Xiaokun, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman, replied in this way. On economic and trade issues, China's position is consistent and clear. We hope the United States will work with China to act on the important common understandings reached by the two presidents, that's to say Xi and Trump, in their recent phone conversation, make good use of the consultation mechanism, and engage in communication and dialogue on the basis of equality, respect, and mutual benefit, so that there will be more consensus and cooperation and less misperception, and the bilateral relations can achieve steady, sound, and sustainable development. For anything specific, I'd refer you to competent authorities. Now, this on its face doesn't actually answer the question. It doesn't confirm that the Chinese are going to meet with Besant in Stockholm next week, or give the dates, which is what Bloomberg actually asked Guo Xiaokun to confirm. But the Chinese reply also is essentially a polite no about discussions on Iran buying oil from China, buying oil from Iran and Russia. It speaks clearly about how China and the United States need to conduct dialogue on the basis of equality, respect, and mutual benefit, that the purpose should be to put bilateral relations on a steady, sound, and sustainable development basis, and that the discussions should be based on the common understandings reached in a telephone call between Xi Jinping and Trump, the recent telephone call between Xi Jinping and Trump. What that is saying is that China will not discuss its trade relations with third countries. It is as simple as that. They will discuss mutual trade between China and the United States based on what was agreed in London and Geneva, and on the framework agreement reached between Xi Jinping and Trump, but they're not going to start negotiating with the Americans about China's trade relations with third countries. And this has been much elaborated, incidentally, in an article which has just appeared in the Washington Post. Unusual article. It speaks about how China is looking at the various actions that Donald Trump and his administration is taking, that they're saying to themselves that there's nothing very much that China needs to do in order to outmaneuver and isolate the United States, because the erratic behavior of the US president and his officials is doing all of China's work for them. Briefly, the weaponization of tariffs, the eccentric way in which tariffs are imposed and then withdrawn, all of that ultimately works to China's advantage, as does the US's withdrawal from various international institutions, the United States having just, for example, withdrawn from UNESCO. So for all of these reasons, the Chinese are fairly content to let the Americans continue to make mistakes. And the article also goes on to say that China is trying to protect its trading position by reducing its trade exposure to the United States and by ramping up its trade with other third parties. And of course, one of the key ones is Russia. And trade between China and Russia has now achieved a critical mass, and though it is still much less than trade between China and the United States and between China and Europe, the point is that it is already sufficiently important for the Chinese to notice it, if I can put it like that. But given China's priority to develop trade relations with third parties so as to protect themselves from possible future action by the United States, it is impossible for China to compromise on its trade relations with third countries to benefit the United States, because that would undermine China's current trade and now geostrategic policies. So there it is. Now, I am going to just further add here my own brief comment about a profoundly irrational, but also, in my opinion, profoundly immoral study that has just been published by the Hudson Institute one of that endless kaleidoscope of think tanks and institutes and research agencies that, taken together, make up the foreign policy community of the United States. Now, this analysis, this study, which is hundreds of pages long, is quite remarkable in itself. It speaks about the United States needing to prepare for a China once the Communist Party of China has fallen from power. It speaks about the steps the United States ought to take to expedite that much desired event. It discusses how the whole of China, the whole Chinese space, should be reordered by the United States after the fall of the communist government in Beijing, basically to suit American interests. It speaks about looking the other way, in fact, encouraging the secession from China of Chinese regions and provinces. It talks about the setting up of a constitutional convention to decide the future government of China and governance of China, with the United States obviously deeply involved. It proposes the setting up of Nuremberg-type tribunals to try Chinese leaders. Of what exactly? And also of the need to work and carry out studies to rewrite Chinese history so as to inform Chinese people of an alternative view of history to the one they know. Now, Arnaud Bertrand, on his blog, has written a good piece about this bizarre study, which I have to say, to me, is not only immoral. I mean, the reordering of the world's oldest country in this kind of way, and a great civilization in this kind of way. I mean, the idea of doing such a thing is deeply immoral. But also, it is, as Bertrand basically says, megalomaniac to the point of insanity. The point is, though, and this is the key thing, the Chinese themselves, the Chinese leadership, the Politburo and its standing committee are going to be informed that studies like this are in existence in the United States and that people in the United States are discussing how to destabilize China, break up the country, overthrow its government, and put its leaders, the leaders of that government, on trial. So, given that this is so, given that the Chinese can see all of these things, why would they facilitate their own downfall, which is what the Americans, well, at least, or some Americans, are clearly seeking to do by collaborating with the Americans in ending the war in Ukraine on American terms? I say that there's actually been a further article in the Financial Times by the dissident Russian economist Alexander Gabuyev. I said dissident, he's based in the West today. Its title is Europe's approach to China and Russia isn't working. Economic threats won't help EU leaders put pressure on Beijing. Cooperation and the right incentives might. And the article acknowledges that China now has a vested interest in the stability of Russia, which has become a critical ally and partner of China, and that the Chinese are not going to be threatened or bullied or intimidated about interchanging that policy. this is some of the things that the Gabuyev article says. China has a vital interest in strengthening a partnership with China that's increasingly on China's terms. Beijing is grooming Moscow as a long-term junior partner, and unlike the West, is preparing for a post-Putin Russia by cultivating ties to all the players who may one day shape the Kremlin's trajectory. And, well, I don't know about junior partner, but all the rest there is basically true. He also points out that some of the recent sanctions intended to penalize Chinese entities for conducting trade with Russia, are actually going to consolidate China-Russia trade. China isn't very impressed by the coercive tools that Europe is trying to deploy, such as the most recent sanctions. Beijing has demonstrated its ability to create adaptable infrastructure designed to support Russia. New EU restrictions against two regional banks will only cement their role as the Chinese government's specialized tools for trade with Moscow. And, well, you can see that in issue after issue, in segment after segment. China's economy is so vast and so complex that the segments of it that have to trade with Russia can actually be kept quite small and isolated from the rest, if that is what the Chinese government, how the Chinese government uses to play it. Anyway, the point is, Gabuyev appears to recognize that China, as he puts it, won't dump Russia anytime soon, and making frustration over that reality one of the organizing principles of Europe's China policy won't help. And the same is true of the United States. They are not going to be able to force the Chinese to change policy with Russia, quite apart from the fact that the Chinese made it fairly clear that they basically agree with Russian perspectives of the Ukraine crisis. They share the views that the Russians have about the crisis. And putting aside the fact that it does seem that at the level of the leaderships, Chinese and Russian, going beyond Putin and Xi, there is now general attitudes of trust and friendship between the two countries. Putting all of that aside, Chinese national interests dictate that China and Russia should hold together. Russian national interests, by the way, dictate the same as well. These attempts that the West constantly makes to ply the two apart are not going to succeed, because each of these two countries now has a vested interest in the relationship with the other and will continue to support the other. So, given that all of this is the case, we come back to the question of what Donald Trump is going to do and the negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. Now, Peskov, Putin's spokesman, warned us not to expect magical breakthroughs at the negotiations, and he's of course right. The Russians are showing no sign that they're prepared to compromise on anything. They want the Ukrainians to discuss their memorandum. I don't think Zelensky wants to change course on the memorandum. I think if Donald Trump wants to find some kind of diplomatic breakthrough which is going to change the direction of events, then he's probably misguided. And I don't think the Chinese are going to come to his rescue either. And to repeat what I said many times, if the Chinese defy him and he eventually pulls back from his threat of imposing tariffs against them, as I suspect he will, then he cannot, in all honesty, impose those tariffs on India, because doing so would enrage India and would alienate it from Trump and from the United States at a time when Indian-Chinese relations are improving. I noticed that earlier today, the Indian government relaxed visa restrictions on Chinese visitors, just by way of example. Anyway, there it is. So, a lot of things going on in Ukraine, protests there, diplomacy in Istanbul. It's the military situation that is ultimately determining the outcome of the war. And, well, there have been more reports over the last 24 hours. Mostly they center on the situation around Konstantinovka, where the Russians have made further advances, further fragmenting the Ukrainian defenses south of Konstantinovka. There's reports that this village of Sherbinovka, located immediately to the west of Pokrovsk, of Toretsk, which the Russians, by the way, briefly captured during the winter. Then the Ukrainians recaptured it, probably because the Russians withdrew, because it looks like it was some kind of a maneuver by the Russians to gain control of Toretsk. Anyway, the Ukrainians then moved back into this village. Now it looks as if they've been pushed out again. This village could be described as the last remaining part of the Toretsk conurbation. It looks as if it's now passed under Russian control. And there's more reports of further Russian advances. And as I said, the noose on the Ukrainian soldiers south of the Kliman-Bek reservoir seems to be tightening all the time. And by the way, there's been some more reports from Chasiv Yar, where that incredibly protracted battle looks like we are now definitely in its last days. According to, I believe it was TASS, the Ukrainians now only control some buildings in the Yuzhny micro-district. This micro-district, which is detached from Chasiv Yar itself, which is under Russian control, it looks as if this micro-district is indeed going to pass under Russian control very soon, might already have done so. And, well, at some point, no doubt, over the next days or weeks, the Russian Defense Ministry will finally announce the capture of Chasiv Yar. So we have those events taking place. We've got further reports of further Russian advances in Zaporozhye region, in the western Donbass towards the Dnieper. There's been fighting in Sumy region. The Ukrainians continue to make endless efforts to capture this village of Kondratyevka that the Russians captured in Sumy region, appearing to suffer very, very heavy losses in doing so, to no obvious purpose that I can see. The Russians, by the way, claimed that they've captured another village in this area. I'm not going to devote time to it. And Group of Forces North continues to speak of more Russian advances in Volchansk. But the big story remains Pokrovsk. Now, yesterday I said that I thought that the village of Novotoretsk, which the Russians claimed to have captured, was located in the area to the northeast of Pokrovsk, though I couldn't find it on any map, but then I'm not good at reading maps. Then the reports came through from the various Telegram channels and mapping projects, and it turned out that this village is indeed located to the northeast of Pokrovsk. And the Russian news agency TASS, rather interestingly, says that the Russians are now attacking the village of Fyodorivka, also in this area, that after the fall of Novotorets, they're able to attack this particular village. Now, I ought to say there's all sorts of commentators and reporters out there who have been claiming for several days that the Russians were in control of this place already. But according to TASS, that is not the case. They never reached it. They've only reached it now. They are attacking it, and they will eventually capture it. And there are, again, reports about Russian forces having pushed further north towards other places. It's very difficult to get a proper sense of exactly with what is happening. As I said, the information about Fyodorivka, that it's not actually under Russian control, the TASS is providing, and it is, after all, Russia's official news agency, ought to be a warning against moving too quickly and making too many assumptions and perhaps getting ahead of actual events based on the rumours and claims that are coming from the front lines. But nonetheless, no one can deny, based even on this information, the fall of Novotorets, the apparent storming of Fyodorivka, that the Russians are indeed improving their positions north and east of Pokrovsk. The noose on Pokrovsk is indeed tightening, and it does seem to me as if before long the Russians will indeed be making that attack on Rodinske that I was talking about. Indeed, that very same report, the report in TASS, which spoke about the Russian attack on Fyodorivka being about to take place, said that after Fyodorivka is captured, the Russians will be moving on to Rodinske itself. And probably there are Russian forces located outside Rodinske, but it does look as if the Russians are intent on clearing the various villages to the north of this area before they march on Rodinske itself, and, as I said, cut off the Ukrainians that way. Now, I would say that the Russian advances, and including ones towards places like Poltavka and other places in this area, northeast of Pokrovsk, also undoubtedly have a bearing on the future battle for Konstantinovka, which will surely follow once Pokrovsk itself has fallen. But anyway, the battle for Pokrovsk continues, and yesterday and the day before, I was speaking about reports about how Russian troops were, there was now film confirmation of the presence of Russian troops deep inside Pokrovsk, in the central areas of Pokrovsk, and I'm sure many of you have seen the video of the Ukrainian passenger car with the Ukrainian soldiers being ambushed by the Russians in central Pokrovsk. Now, there's been less precise information about what is going on in central and southern Pokrovsk, but Deep State, the Ukrainian mapping project, has now marked large areas of southern Pokrovsk, or at least south of Pokrovsk, as being in the so-called grey zone. In other words, contested territory. And that does seem to me as a kind of admission that some kind of Russian breakthrough in this area is indeed happening. It's difficult to get a more accurate picture, and of course the Russian Defense Ministry is telling us nothing. And there continues to be this very, very tight information control that I spoke about in previous programs. So it's difficult to know exactly what is taking place there. But Radovka, the Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, which has been providing fairly detailed accounts of the various battles. It does a daily update, by the way, every day, as part of its the last information that it provides on the state of the battle. Anyway, Redovka claimed that the Ukrainians now are so short of infantry in this area, in Pokrovsk, that they have been obliged to make the decision to withdraw from the outskirts, the southern outskirts of Pokrovsk, and to concentrate in the more heavily built up and more defendable centre of the town. Now, of course, that may make a certain sense, but retreating deep into the heart of a town does, of course, risk encirclement. It means that it becomes easier for the supply roads to the west, the remaining supply road to the west, to be cut. And, well, there's been suggestions that the Russians, who apparently already occupy Zvirovo village to the southwest of Pokrovsk, and may, according to the latest reports, occupy or have some kind of control over territory in the south of Pokrovsk, that the Russians could actually advance through Pokrovsk itself to cut the E50 road, which is the main supply road, the last remaining supply road into Pokrovsk. I've already said that the northern road that passes through Rodinske must now be unusable given the presence of Russian drones and of Russian artillery. And, well, if that is correct, then if this E50 road is also cut, maybe within the boundary of Pokrovsk itself, then the Ukrainian troops in Pokrovsk are caught in a cauldron similar to the one that the Ukrainian troops who were defending Mariupol also in the end found themselves in. So anyway, that's one possibility. But to repeat again, we don't have very detailed information about what is going on. There's little actual confirmation, to the extent that there are reports from a semi-reliable source. They tend to come from deep state, which is Ukrainian. They do show a deteriorating situation for Ukraine, but they may not be telling the complete story. In fact, probably they are not telling the complete story. Anyway, there it is. Now, General Syrsky, Ukraine's military chief, has been talking about the military situation. And a couple of weeks ago, I mentioned that a source had told me that Ukraine's crisis in artillery over the course of the autumn and winter was abated as a result of the massive supply of artillery and shells, basically by Turkey to Ukraine, artillery and shells taken from former Syrian army stocks, which became available after the fall of Assad's government. And this same source then told me sometime later that Ukraine had basically run through this former Syrian stockpile of shells, which, by the way, had caused Ukraine to revert to using Soviet-type guns and Soviet shells, because the Syrian shells are, of course, mostly of Soviet manufacture, or were made to Soviet specifications for firing from the Soviet artillery with which Syria was supplied. So Ukraine this source told me, this is about 2 weeks ago, that Ukraine was about again to run out of shells. Well, this source has proved consistently reliable about information coming from Ukraine, and Syrsky's comments show that he has been reliable again, because Syrsky is now complaining once again that Ukraine is now desperately short of shells. He says that shells are running out, artillery is running out, the situation is becoming very bad, there is an acute shortage of shells and also of armoured vehicles. And Syrsky says that Ukraine needs new deliveries of shells, 155mm artillery shells, more armoured vehicles, and of course he also says that Ukraine needs Patriot missiles, interceptor drones, light aircraft for shooting down drones might help, and things of that kind. He wants endless quantities of shells and machines and things to be provided by the West. And by the way, he's also said that yes, it's true, he turns 60 shortly, it's his 60th birthday, but no, he does not intend to retire. His intention is to continue to be Ukraine's military chief, despite the fact that he's now reached retirement age. So Ukraine, again, short of shells. It's short of Patriot missile interceptors. It's short of armoured vehicles, and it's coming to the West to get them. It wants the United States to supply them, perhaps not directly. The Europeans will pay and buy them for Ukraine from the United States. But we've seen that the United States has not been able to increase production of shells to anything like the extent that the Biden administration said it would. The second factory to make 155mm shells is not operating properly. There have been all kinds of teething problems. The latest reports in the United States said that instead of 100,000 shells a month, 155mm shells a month, the United States is only producing 40,000 shells a month. Just enough to cover Ukraine's needs if all of those shells were shipped to Ukraine, but not enough to meet the US's needs or those of the US's allies, or to replenish the already very heavily depleted US stockpiles of shells. And as I understand it across Europe, the situation is every bit as bad now. But we see that the demands from Ukraine don't stop coming. We might be short in the West of air defense interceptors, Patriot missile interceptors. We may be short of tanks. But the Ukrainians come back always and ask for more and more. Yesterday, I spoke about how the new Ukrainian defense minister, Mr. Shmyhal, is now asking for $120 billion, or says that Ukraine is going to need $120 billion next year to meet the needs of its military and to sustain the war. $120 billion. He says that $60 billion of that must come from the West. But in reality, of course, all of it will. Because even if the remaining $60 billion comes from Ukraine's own budget, as we know, who basically now funds that budget? Why, the West does. It's we who give money to Ukraine to keep the budget together. It is we who are going to buy the shells and the other weapons for Ukraine as well. One way or the other, the whole $120 billion tab is coming our way. Now, I should say that I mentioned in my program yesterday how the sums of money are mounting up all the time. The costs are escalating all the time and are dwarfing the sums requested by Professor Jeffrey Sachs in the 1990s, 1990, 1991, as part of the so-called Grand Bargain that might have secured peace between Russia and the West at that time. Those sums that Professor Sachs was asking for, $150 billion at that time, spaced out over 5 years, not 3, would have been far less than what we're spending on this one war. Just saying. And, we're not even adding together all the other costs on the West's rearmament that we've been hearing floating around, the 5% of GDP on defense spending, Germany's extravagant new rearmament program, which I predict is going to lead nowhere at all, except eventually to financial collapse. All of that. Anyway, suffice to say that we probably will discuss all of this shortly on a program on the Duran, and please look out for it. But the demands from Ukraine never stop and will continue for as long as the war goes on. And as I discussed earlier in the program, Zelensky himself is not interested in ending the war and wants it to go on for as long as possible. And so many European leaders do. And I was reading an article, a very depressing, indeed very upsetting article, I found it so, by Martin Wolf in the Financial Times on this very same topic. He is the economic writer, the main economic writer on the Financial Times. He recently wrote a very interesting piece about Britain's deepening economic problems. He made the extraordinary admission, with which, by the way, I agree, that the Thatcher experiment of the 1980s ultimately failed, that it did not regenerate Britain's economy. It merely made possible credit booms, which have now exhausted themselves, leaving the underlying social and economic fabric of Britain weaker rather than stronger. Well, that is my view. I know some people will push back. But anyway, that's also apparently Martin Wolf's view. But in this article, even as he shows awareness of Britain's economic plight and presumably knows about the similar economic plight of much of Europe, including, by the way, Germany, where deindustrialization processes continue. Anyway, he continues to demand unending, infinite support for Ukraine. He says in this article that the war in Ukraine is of decisive importance, that it is changing the global landscape. That's about the only part of his article which I find myself in agreement with. It is indeed true that this is the most important thing that is going on in the world today, the most important event that is taking place in the world today. The title of his article is "The Ukraine War Will Shape the World." It is doing so. I've discussed this many times. But his conclusion is that because it's shaping the world, the West cannot afford to lose it and must put all its chips on the table. It must give every single weapon. I mean, that's the logic of his article. It's not quite what the article says, but the logic of it is that it must throw everything it has into winning in Ukraine, even as it is losing in Ukraine. It's an astonishing thing, an astonishing article to read. It accepts that things are not going well on the Ukrainian battlefields, that things are becoming increasingly difficult there. It still insists that the Russians have only gained have gained less than 1% of Ukraine's territory since 2024. A meaningless statistic, by the way, which is often quoted in the West and which might not even be true. Just saying. It's not the question of whether the Russians have gained X percentage points of Ukrainian territory. It's how strong or weak Ukraine is, and as we've seen, it is depleting all the time. Even Ukrainians themselves are saying so. He says that it would be a disaster for the West if Ukraine lost. A victorious Russia would, this is his from an extract of his article, a victorious Russia would be the biggest military power in Europe, directly threatening neighbouring members of NATO and the EU, with the United States increasingly indifferent to the fate of the continent. This would leave Europe both scared and weak. Well, first of all, I'm not sure how exactly the Russians are threatening neighbouring members of NATO and the EU. They deny that they are. But anyway, the point is that that was a compelling reason, I would have thought, not to risk a war with Russia in Ukraine in the first place. After all, it's always been said that Russia has escalatory dominance there. The outcome was always likely to be bad. It's rather extraordinary to be complaining about that outcome now, when we in the West went out of our way to bring it about, just to say. But anyway, the point is that for Martin Wolf, things are so bad, the risk of Russia dominating Europe as the major military power in Europe, the loss of reputation. What happens if the axis of Russia, again I'm quoting, China and North Korea win? What will happen to the balance of forces and ideas across the world? Who will believe in or trust those who claim to uphold freedom and democracy when they are prepared to shrug at these ideals and shrug as these ideas are brutally expunged on their very borders? So his answer to all of this is to go back and go on supporting Ukraine. Russia has been unable to win so far, despite having a population almost 4 times as big as that of Ukraine, and a GDP at purchasing power parity more than 10 times as large. So, despite that, that must mean that because the Russians haven't won so far, despite all of the military assistance, disregarding all the military assistance that we've so far been provided, we've got to give the Ukrainians even more. We've got to go on supplying Ukraine with still more money, still more weapons, US military equipment, especially offensive equipment, is of vital importance. The Europeans will have to produce more themselves, finance Ukraine's production, buy directly from the United States. I'm quoting again. Donald Trump's recent falling out with Putin might help here. And anyway, I mean, he wants to just go on investing Europe's wealth, what's left of it, in a failing project. It astonishes me that there it is. We could have had peace. We might have been able to secure peace in 1991 for the cost of $150 billion of that time's money. Would have been more today because values have changed. But anyway, $150 billion. Here comes Shmyhal. He wants 120 billion next year, and we're going to give it to him. Zelensky, Syrsky, they want more weapons, more shells. We're going to strip our arsenals even more bare and give it to them. We're going to pay the Americans to replace all those weapons, except that the Americans won't be able to replace those weapons because they're having production issues of their own. And, well, beyond that, they have all of those other security issues around the world to worry about. Well, it's often been said that doing the same thing again and again and again is a sign of madness. Tell me that at this stage in the war, with a crisis in Pokrovsk, with the Russians dominating the skies, with the Chinese making their opinions increasingly clear, and by the way, increasing their economic growth, tell me that this isn't madness. Because all I can say is, to me, that is exactly what it looks like, how it looks. Now, I'm going to finish with one very last thing. I discussed yesterday the meeting between Putin and Larijani and the Iranian defense minister in Moscow. I said to me that looked like a planning meeting, and Iran looks like it's preparing to finally build up its defenses with the help of its friends. Russia, obviously. China, probably too. And we're likely to see weapons supplies and other things arriving in Iran before long. Now, Iran is going to be meeting the European leaders fairly soon, the European countries very soon. Arakshi has confirmed it. Nobody seems to expect anything very much to come out of that meeting. But there are rumours that a far more important high-level meeting is being prepared. This one between Iran, China, and Russia, all three. Now, I don't know where this meeting will take place. I don't know at what level it's going to happen. I'm not even sure that this meeting is indeed scheduled, but there are reports that it is. It seems to me that certainly in the case of Iran, the Eurasian states are now being finally brought in and are indeed coming in. Something that could very quickly change the balance and the dynamic of events in the Middle East. And, well, even as that happens, Donald Trump will continue to get the demands and the calls to go on supplying Patriot air defense missile interceptors, which the United States increasingly doesn't have, and other types of weapons to a Ukraine which everybody can see is going to lose the war. It's, as I said, baffling. But at this stage, maybe one should not be surprised by it. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish my program today. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.